RAM decides how fast your computer actually feels. Not your CPU, not your GPU, RAM. Over the last 25 years, RAM has evolved through multiple generations. DDR1, DDR2, DDR3, DDR4, and DDR5. Each changing how data moves, how much power is used, and how modern software performs. They may look similar, but internally, they're completely different. In this video, we'll explain every DDR RAM generation, what actually changed, and which one makes sense today, without unnecessary specs or confusion. DDR1. Before DDR1, personal computers relied on SDRAM, a type of memory that could transfer data only once per clock cycle. As software became heavier and multitasking more common, this limitation quickly became a major bottleneck. Processors were fast enough to request data, but memory simply couldn't deliver it in time. Systems felt sluggish not because CPUs were weak, but because RAM couldn't keep up. DDR1 changed that fundamental limitation. DDR stands for double data rate, meaning memory could transfer data twice per clock cycle instead of once. This single architectural change dramatically increased memory throughput without requiring higher clock speeds. When DDR1 launched in 2000, the difference was immediately noticeable. Programs opened faster, systems felt more responsive, and multitasking became practical for everyday users. DDR1 operated at around 2.5 volts, used 184 pins on desktop DIMMs and 200 pins on laptop SO-DIMMs, and featured a centered notch to prevent incorrect installation. Effective speeds ranged from 200 to 400 MHz, delivering up to 3.2 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. Individual modules typically maxed out at 1 gigabyte, which was considered high-end at the time. DDR1 was widely used in early Pentium 4 and AMD Athlon systems and marked the true beginning of modern memory design. However, its high voltage led to increased heat and poor power efficiency. DDR2 arrived in 2003 as the industry's attempt to push memory bandwidth higher while reducing the heat and power problems introduced by DDR1. The focus shifted from raw responsiveness to throughput and efficiency, reflecting how computers were beginning to handle heavier multitasking and more complex applications. The most visible change was voltage. DDR2 reduced operating voltage from 2.5 volts to 1.8 volts, significantly lowering power consumption and heat output. This made systems more stable and allowed manufacturers to pack more memory into smaller spaces. Pin count increased to 240 pins on desktop DIMMs, and the notch was moved slightly off-center to ensure DDR2 could not be inserted into DDR1 slots. DDR2 also increased effective clock speeds dramatically. While DDR1 topped out at 400 MHz, DDR2 scaled from 400 MHz up to 1066 MHz, pushing bandwidth to roughly 8.5 gigabytes per second. To support this, DDR2 introduced 4N prefetch, allowing it to fetch more data per cycle than DDR1. However, DDR2 introduced a new compromise: latency. Although it could move more data per second, it often took longer to begin transferring that data. In lighter workloads, DDR2 sometimes felt no faster or even slightly slower than well-tuned DDR1 systems. DDR2 powered mid-2000s platforms such as Intel Core, 2 Duo, and early AMD Phenom systems. Capacities increased to 4 gigabytes per module, enabling more serious multitasking. DDR2 was not beloved, but it was essential. It established the efficiency and scaling principles that later generations would refine and perfect. DDR3 launched in 2007, and unlike DDR2, it didn't feel like a compromise. This was the generation where memory performance finally aligned with how people actually use their computers. Multitasking, gaming, and creative work were becoming mainstream, and DDR3 was built to handle that shift. Efficiency improved again. Standard operating voltage dropped to 1.5 volts, with 1.35 volt low-power variants introduced later for laptops and energy-conscious systems. Pin count remained at 240, but the notch moved once more to prevent mixing it with DDR2. These changes reduced heat, improved stability, and extended battery life. DDR3 significantly expanded speed and bandwidth. It operated between 800 and 2133 MHz, pushing memory bandwidth beyond 17 gigabytes per second. Internally, DDR3 introduced 8N prefetch, allowing it to retrieve more data per cycle, and improved signal routing using a flyby topology, which made higher speeds more reliable. Capacity was another major leap. DDR3 supported up to 16 gigabytes per module, making 8 GB and 16 GB systems realistic for everyday users. This changed how computers were used, systems booted faster, applications stayed open without slowing down, and games loaded smoothly. DDR3 powered some of the most respected CPUs ever made, including Intel's i5 2500K and i7 3770K. Many of these systems remain functional today. DDR4 DDR4 launched in 2014, and at first it didn't feel urgent. DDR3 was still fast enough for most users, and early DDR4 offered only modest gains while requiring a new motherboard. For several years, DDR4 existed quietly in the background, waiting for software and CPUs to catch up. But architecturally, DDR4 was a major step forward. Operating voltage dropped again to 1.2 volts, reducing power draw and heat, while improving long-term stability. Pin count increased to 288, and the notch position changed to prevent compatibility errors. Initial DDR4 speeds started around 2133 MHz, but the design allowed much higher ceilings. As memory controllers improved, DDR4 scaled to 3200 MHz, then beyond, with enthusiast kits pushing far higher. But the most important addition was bank groups, a feature that allowed memory to handle multiple operations in parallel instead of waiting in line. This is where DDR4 truly separated itself from earlier generations. Everything changed in 2017 with the arrival of AMD's Ryzen processors. Ryzen architectures were highly sensitive to memory speed and latency, and suddenly DDR4 performance had a measurable impact on real-world results, especially in gaming and productivity. Faster RAM meant higher frame rates and smoother multitasking. By the early 2020, DDR4 became the undisputed standard. It offered the best balance of performance, efficiency, capacity, and cost. And for most users, it still does today. DDR5 arrived in 2021, and unlike previous transitions, it wasn't meant to solve yesterday's problems. It was designed around where computing is heading next: heavier multitasking, data-intensive workloads, and CPUs that demand far more parallel access to memory. Power efficiency improved again, with operating voltage reduced to 1.1 volts. DDR5 kept the 288-pin form factor, but the notch position changed to make it physically incompatible with DDR4. Base speeds began at 4,800 MHz, already higher than most DDR4 kits. DDR5 splits each memory module into two independent subchannels, allowing simultaneous data access where previous generations handled tasks sequentially. This increases efficiency under heavy workloads and reduces bottlenecks when multiple cores are requesting data at the same time. DDR5 also introduces on-die error correction, improving reliability during sustained operations. These changes make DDR5 especially effective for professional workloads, 3D rendering, large datasets, virtual machines, and high-resolution video editing. In gaming, gains are real but situational, appearing most clearly in CPU-limited scenarios rather than GPU-bound ones. The drawbacks are cost and platform requirements. DDR5 requires a compatible CPU and motherboard, making upgrades expensive. For many users, DDR4 remains sufficient today. DDR5 isn't about immediate necessity, it's about preparing systems for the demands of the next generation of software and hardware. When you look at DDR memory as a whole, one pattern becomes very clear. Every generation exists to solve the limitations of the one before it. DDR1 broke the single transfer barrier and made modern multitasking possible. DDR2 focused on efficiency and throughput, even if it came with trade-offs. DDR3 refined the formula and finally matched real-world usage, defining an entire era of PCs. DDR4 scaled that foundation, becoming the most balanced and widely adopted memory standard to date. And DDR5 isn't about fixing today's problems, it's about preparing for tomorrow's workloads. If you're still on DDR3, the platform itself has reached the end of its life. Modern CPUs and software have moved on, and performance will increasingly feel constrained. If you're using DDR4, you're still in a very strong position. For gaming, general productivity, streaming, and even most creative work, DDR4 offers excellent performance at reasonable cost. If you're building a new system today, especially with the latest CPUs, DDR5 makes sense, not because it's mandatory, but because it provides headroom for the future. More RAM does not automatically mean better performance. For most users, 16 GB is ideal. For heavier multitasking or content creation, 32 GB is the practical ceiling. Beyond that, gains depend entirely on specific workloads. Understanding DDR generations helps you avoid wasted upgrades and build systems that age gracefully. RAM may not be the most exciting component, but it quietly decides how modern your computer really feels. You've just seen how RAM affects performance by controlling how quickly your CPU can access active data. But there's another part of your system that influences how fast everything starts: storage. And this is where most people get confused. SSD, M2, NVM, PCI, SATA, AHC. They sound like random letters, but they determine how long your system takes to boot, how fast games load, and how responsive your computer feels when opening files. Here's the part that often gets overlooked. Choosing the wrong type of storage can hurt everyday performance more than slow RAM, because you feel it every single time you turn your computer on or launch an application. In the next video, we're breaking down every SSD type in plain language. What each term actually means, how they differ in real-world use, which ones are worth paying for, and which ones aren't. No hype, no overspending, just clarity. I'll see you there.